Today, we're opening a really fascinating, but I have to say, deeply unsettling stack of sources.
Hmm.
They challenge really everything we think we know about identity.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at what happens when the very architecture of the human self is shattered. And not by some, philosophical doubt, but by blunt physical trauma.
It's so easy for us to talk about the physical results of an accident. A broken arm, a visible injury. We can see it, we can understand
Right,
it.
it's concrete.
Exactly. But when the trauma hits the brain, the changes that come after are, well, they're often invisible, but they're fundamentally existential.
The person you knew, the entire story they lived by.
It can just cease to exist.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission in this deep dive is to really explore that fallout, both the clinical side and the deeply personal side of severe traumatic brain injury, or TBI.
And we're going to be using some incredibly detailed case studies to try and understand what happens when the physical brain just can't sustain that continuous sense of self anymore. And we are immediately drawn into one of the most clinically astonishing and frankly heartbreaking stories in neurological history. It's the journey of a man known as Patient P.A.
Right.
He was a successful physician whose identity fragmented so severely after a car crash that he began cycling through what our sources call borrowed identity syndrome.
It's hard to even wrap your head around.
I mean, can you imagine waking up and not just having amnesia, but having your very sense of who you are just constantly shifting hour by hour?
And we really have to emphasize this isn't some isolated 1 in a billion phenomenon. I mean, PA's case is uniquely severe, yes, but TBI itself is a massive, often chronic global health issue.
Okay, so what kind of numbers are we talking about?
The sources give a huge range, but they say between 25 and 88% of patients who survive a moderate or severe TBI, they go on to develop chronic neuropsychiatric symptoms.
NPS.
And these aren't symptoms that just fade away as the bruises heal. Not at all. That's the crucial point. They are tenacious. They persist long after the patient has, for all intents and purposes, recovered physically. And they lead to these enduring changes in personality, in emotion, and self-recognition that just profoundly change their entire future.
Okay, so let's unpack this tragedy, this complexity of Patient PA. Where do we start?
We have to start before the accident. Before 1998, he was a man really at the peak of his professional life.
He was 43, living in Poland, a board-certified gynecologist and obstetrician.
And not just any doctor. He was the head of his department, a very prestigious position.
So highly successful.
Very. And he had a full life outside of work. He was married. He had 3 children who were aged 13, 19, and 26 at the time.
And what was he like as a person?
His colleagues described him as highly intelligent and, this is a key detail, a known wit. He had a great sense of humor. He also had very strong personal choices, a vegetarian, a smoker, a moderate drinker. This was a unique, highly developed human being with a very complex biography.
And that complexity wasn't just professional, was it? The sources point to some significant personal turmoil right before the accident.
They do, and it provides this chilling context for everything that happened next. He was in the middle of a massive marital crisis.
His wife had discovered he was having an affair.
Yes, with a woman he reportedly considered the love of his life.
Wow.
And that's an essential detail because it means his life, right at that moment, was loaded with this intense, recent emotional resonance. That was the state of his personal world when the catastrophe struck.
A car accident.
The car accident. He sustained a very, very severe TBI. He swerved to avoid a collision and ended up striking a tree head-on.
His wife was in the car with him.
She was in the passenger seat. Miraculously, she was uninjured.
And the sources suggest he might have steered at the very last second to take the full impact himself, an action that might have saved her.
It might have.
Yeah.
But it resulted in just devastating damage to his own brain. The physical trauma was extreme. He lost consciousness immediately.
And we know his Glasgow Coma Scale score, the GCS, was a 3.
A 3. And for anyone listening who isn't familiar with the GCS, that is the lowest possible score you can get.
It basically means no response.
No response in any category, eyes, verbal, motor. It indicates deep unresponsiveness and usually a very poor prognosis.
And he stayed in that state for a long time.
A very long time. He was in a coma for 63 days. And then the period of post-traumatic amnesia, where the brain just can't form new memories or clearly recall old ones, that lasted a staggering 98 days.
So that's more than 3 months of his life that is essentially a blank space.
But total blank. And when they finally did the neuroimaging, it showed the injury was highly localized or focal. It was concentrated in the right hemisphere of his brain.
Which specific areas were hit?
It was the gyrus rectus, the lower frontal gyrus, and parts of the temporal gyrus. And these are regions that are just critical for emotional regulation, for social behavior, and for linking memory with personal context.
So the damage was in exactly the wrong places for maintaining a sense of self.
Precisely. And the immediate clinical presentation was just extensive. You had the physical symptoms, like hemiparesis, which is weakness on one side of the body,
And severe sleep problems.
severe, narcolepsy, vivid nightmares. But the psychological and the self-recognition issues,
Yeah.
they were truly what defined his case from the very beginning.
Right, because the injury immediately robbed him of two critical functions.
Two critical functions. The
Oh.
first was anosognosia. That's a lack of insight into his own deficits. He was completely unaware that he was sick or that he had changed.
He didn't know he was injured.
He had no idea. And the second was prosopagnosia.
The inability to recognize familiar faces.
That's right. He confused his own close relatives. And just shockingly, he failed to recognize his own children. This really set the stage for the dramatic misidentification syndromes that followed.
What's so profound and so difficult to grasp about P.A.'s condition is that the loss of his autobiographical memory, the emotional bonds that tied him to his life, it was almost total.
Almost total. The sources note that at first he sort of retained this thin veneer of objective facts about himself. You could call it third-person data.
Like his name, his profession.
Maybe. But the subjective, the first-person experience of being P.A., that was gone. And even that objective data faded away later on.
This is the essence of the rupture, isn't it? His brain couldn't connect what his eyes were seeing with the deep emotional meaning that should have been there.
Exactly. He couldn't integrate the sensory perception of his loved ones with the emotional and personal meaning that had previously defined those relationships. And this manifested as these classic misidentification syndromes.
Like the denial of his family. It's a textbook presentation of Capgras syndrome, right? Where
Yeah.
a person believes a loved one has been replaced by an imposter.
A perfect example. He insisted his wife and his children, including his 19-year-old daughter, were body doubles. He called them imposters.
And he would get agitated.
He would shout that his actual family had been killed in the accident. So for him, the people standing right there caring for him, they were terrifying strangers pretending to be his loved ones.
It's that inability to match the familiarity of the face with the emotional warmth that's required for recognition.
The emotional tag is just missing. And the severing of that emotional connection is even more stark when we think about the other woman in his life.
The woman he called the love of his life, the focal point of that marital crisis right before the accident.
When she came to visit him, his denial was absolute. He just showed complete non-recognition, screaming things like, "I don't know you."
And later, when staff asked about her,
He just angrily dismissed her as that hag and insisted he had never, ever had a lover. All of that intense, emotionally charged history they shared had been vaporized.
it's just gone.
That's
But
right.
there's a fascinating detail here. Moments after denying her existence, he would spontaneously say something to his therapist.
Yes. He would comment that it was unethical for a physician to date a patient.
And she had been his patient.
She had. And this is a perfect window into how the brain's filing system works after trauma.
So the semantic memory, the factual, impersonal rule that doctors shouldn't date patients.
That remained perfectly intact. But the episodic memory, the personal, emotionally resonant memory that I love this woman and I dated her, was completely inaccessible.
The memory of the emotion, the desire, the history, gone. But the abstract rule was still there.
The abstract professional fact remained.
And this denial, it extended beyond humans, which is what makes P.A.'s case so unusual. He denied his own dog.
Yes, the sources really highlight this as a unique detail. It just illustrates the sheer scale of the personal memory loss. Before the accident, he was extremely close to his dachshund.
And when the dog was brought to the hospital,
He recoiled. He called it a lump of fur like that and expressed genuine fear. He thought the pet wanted to bite her.
so even that strong, primal, nonverbal bond, the one we often think of as unconditional,
That was severed too. It suggests the damage didn't just affect complex human relationships, but the underlying mechanisms of attachment itself.
it's terrifying. And his lack of self-recognition was just as dramatic.
It was. He exhibited the classic mirror sign.
What happened there?
A therapist held up a full-length mirror, and P.A. was terrified. He shouted, "Oh my God, that monster is staring at me."
But at the same time, he could recognize the therapist standing next to him.
Exactly. He recognized and spoke to the therapist perfectly. He could identify another person, but the reflection of his own integrated self was a terrifying unknown.
So his mind was struggling not just with memory, but with coherence. He could remember his name for maybe 10 minutes.
And then the entire interaction, the therapist, the mirror, the recognition, it would just be erased.
Because that internal slate was constantly resetting, his brain couldn't maintain a continuous biography.
It couldn't. So he began desperately looking for external anchors. And this led to what the researchers termed borrowed identity syndrome. It's a form of autophagy syndrome, where he just started adopting the identities of the people around him.
So this wasn't just confusion. This was an active search for some kind of structure to inhabit.
An active search. And his initial search went backward into his own fractured past.
He claimed he was only a child.
He claimed he was only 7 or 8 years old. He could vaguely remember childhood up to that age, and that was it. When they asked him about his job, he'd sometimes say he was a car mechanic.
Which he never was.
Never. But it's what he dreamed of being as a young boy. His identity just contracted severely. It retreated to the last dimly remembered place where his self felt safe and coherent.
And the sources have this remarkable piece of evidence from his therapy sessions that just speaks volumes about this internal void.
The drawing of the ladybug.
Yes.
It's such a powerful metaphor for his state. He drew the insect, and then he wrote this devastating sentence next to it.
He wrote, "My insides remind me of a ladybug. She's looking for something because it's empty inside her, like it's empty inside me."
It just perfectly captures that profound existential vacuum that's created when the brain's narrative systems fail. He knew something was missing, and the only solution his brain could find was to fill that emptiness with someone else's story.
And this borrowing was almost instantaneous if he was near a particular patient.
He'd adopt their characteristics. For instance, there was a 6-year-old clone patient on the ward. P.A. would immediately start shouting that he, too, was a cloned 6-year-old monster. He was mirroring the identity, almost trying to connect through replication.
And there's another stark example with a young man named Jurek.
Jurek, a 19-year-old patient who was recovering from knee surgery.
And P.A. started claiming
that his name was Jurek. He insisted he was the one who'd had the knee operation and that he needed the wheelchair. He adopted the physical status and the name at the same time. He was literally wearing Jurek's identity.
And then there was Zbisek, the art therapist.
Same mechanism. He took Zbisek's paintbrushes, refused to give them back, and claimed he had to paint for a living. He would only answer to the name Zbisek.
This wasn't malicious or delusional in the way we usually think of it.
Not at all. It was a desperate, functional coping mechanism. His brain was just seeking narrative coherence from the most immediate external stimulus it could find.
And the really heartbreaking part here is how unstable it was. These borrowed identities, they didn't stick.
No. He would forget the adopted identity completely, returning to a state of confusion, usually within an hour or two.
And as his condition got worse over time, the delusions became even more fundamental.
And more terrifying. After reading some material about Cotard's delusion, the belief that you're dead or that you're missing organs, P.A. started claiming that he was dead or that he was possibly reincarnated. It was a total loss of orientation.
The constant flux of his self, driven by that profound right frontal lobe damage, just drove him to the ultimate existential conclusion that he simply didn't exist anymore.
Exactly.
This brings us to a really core conceptual paradox in P.A.'s case. It forces us to question how memory and knowledge are even organized in the brain.
Right.
How could a man lose every single emotionally significant memory of his entire life, yet still hold on to this sophisticated functional knowledge base?
This is the classic distinction between semantic and episodic memory. P.A.'s episodic memory, the memory of personal events, the I remember when details, that was devastated.
But his semantic memory?
His semantic memory, the general knowledge, the facts, the acquired professional skills, that was remarkably preserved. And this allowed his functional self to operate in complete isolation from his personal self.
The sources give some chilling evidence of his retained skills. 3 years after the accident, he's advising a pregnant TBI patient on her depression medication.
Giving accurate, professional, expert advice. It's astonishing. He was acting like a board-certified gynecologist without the slightest sense of how or why he had become one.
And then his daughter showed him a 3D ultrasound of a baby.
And P.A. instantly recognized the image. He accurately described the stage of fetal development. He estimated it was the 29th or 30th week. And he commented, like an expert, that the fetus looked healthy.
So he had the technical skill of the physician.
But he had completely lost the personal context of the father and the grandfather.
Because when his daughter proudly told him that this was a picture of his grandson,
He flew into an enraged denial. He started shouting, "I can't be a grandfather because I don't have any children. My whole family died in an accident."
he knew the rules of obstetrics, but he didn't know the story of his own life.
He could discuss the details of gynecological operations. He could even state, factually that people have children to develop a so-called procreative family, to maintain the human species, to pass on their genes.
Completely detached academic answer.
Completely. And at the same time, he denied ever studying medicine. He called his diploma a counterfeit. And he denied his own children because he believes he was only 18 and too young to have children.
The emotional meaning, the sense of lineage, the personal investment.
All of it was severed, leaving behind this pure, objective knowledge set just trapped inside his brain.
And this tragic state wasn't static. It didn't just stay the same. Over the 10 years of observation in the sources, his symptoms became persistent and, in some ways, they got worse.
They did. Residual language issues, severe anxiety, and this bizarre, inappropriate social behavior like laughing uncontrollably during quiet church services, that all became chronic.
And then there was the catastrophic failure of his short-term memory.
Yes, and that indicated a progressive underlying pathology. The memory decay was clinical in its speed and its totality.
The researchers designed a simple experiment to document this.
They did. They just traced his recall of ordinary daily events, like a physical therapy session or a visit from a relative. They wanted to know exactly how long a memory would last.
Okay, let's detail that timeline because it really speaks volumes about the severity of the damage. Immediately after a 2-hour kinesiotherapy session, PA could give a full, accurate account.
100% recall.
Yeah.
The memory was formed. It was there.
But the erosion began immediately.
Immediately. After just 30 minutes, details started slipping away. He still remembered the event, but the context would be fuzzy.
And at 60 minutes, 1 hour.
His sense of time was gone. He only remembered the last half hour, and he'd firmly insist he'd only been in the session for that short period.
Then the confabulations, the brain's attempt to fill in the gaps, started to creep in.
Right, between 60 and 90 minutes. He'd start mixing in details from other sessions or from entirely unrelated events as his brain just struggled to fill the void.
And then the 2-hour mark, 120 minutes.
Total erasure. At this point, he didn't just forget the event, he actively denied it ever happened. He'd become agitated and indignant.
He'd demand to know why the staff were pestering him about something that never happened.
Yes, and sometimes he'd even complain that they had failed to take him to his session that day.
So he wasn't just forgetting, he was forgetting that he had forgotten.
Exactly. He had no meta-awareness of his own memory failure, and forgetting everything, even highly emotional material, within a 2-hour window, and having no insight into that failure. That puts him firmly on the pathological spectrum.
Clinically, where do we see that pattern?
That pattern of memory failure is typical of medium to late stages of dementia.
Which leads directly to this alarming neurodegenerative link. Metabolic testing showed changes in his brain that suggested it was more than just static trauma.
Right. They used a technique called magnetic resonance spectroscopy, or HMRS. And the results revealed a statistically significant drop in something called NAA concentration and a rise in MI concentration, specifically in his damaged right frontal lobe.
Okay, can you break that down for us? What are NAA and MI?
Of course, think of NAA, N-acetylaspartate, as a marker for the health and density of your neurons.
The brain cells themselves.
Right, the core processors. A drop in NAA means the actual neurons are suffering, they're dying, or they're dysfunctional.
Okay, so his processors were struggling. What about the MI?
Myoinositol, or MI, is generally seen as a marker for the brain's support cells, the glial cells. An increase in MI often suggests inflammation or glial proliferation. It's essentially the brain's attempt to respond to or clean up damage.
So seeing these metabolic shifts, low NAA, high MIN at that damaged area years after the accident.
It suggested a chronic active process was still going on.
And these changes mirrored patterns seen in a specific neurodegenerative condition, didn't they?
They did. While PA's metabolic changes were chiefly unilateral, so confined mainly to the damaged right side, they were close to the spectrum you see in frontotemporal dementia, or FTD.
Which is a progressive disease often defined by profound personality and behavioral changes.
Exactly. So this suggests that TBI wasn't a singular event that just resulted in a static deficit. It may have actually initiated a slow, continuous, FTD-like process of progressive damage.
Cases like PA's, they immediately draw parallels to these historical breakthroughs in neuroscience. But before we get to the most famous one, let's talk about a powerful modern example that illustrates that separation of judgment from intellect, a man called Mr. Thompson.
Mr. Thompson, a construction worker, survived an accident where a nail was lodged deeply in his frontal lobe. His story is crucial because it highlights that TBI doesn't just damage memory, it can destroy the capacity for appropriate behavior and rational choice.
And before the injury, Thompson was the classic agreeable guy. Gregarious, sunny, a joker.
A completely different person. After the nail was removed, he was radically altered. He became surly, withdrawn, disinhibited, and he started cursing constantly.
And it affected his family life.
Profoundly. He disparaged his wife of 27 years, and irrationally, he started questioning the paternity of his children. Like P.A., the identity he had spent a lifetime building was replaced overnight by this deeply unpleasant, hostile personality.
And that leads us to the foundational case of acquired personality change, the one that really launched the study of the frontal lobe. Phineas Gage.
The railroad foreman from 1848. His survival after a tamping iron shot through his skull is still one of medicine's most staggering anecdotes.
The iron destroyed a huge portion of his brain, and his physician famously noted that Gage was...
No longer Gage. He went from being shrewd and well-balanced to fitful, irreverent, and profane.
For centuries, we focused on the physical damage, right? The big hole in his left frontal lobe.
Yeah.
But UCLA researchers revisited this case using modern neuroimaging techniques on his preserved skull.
And their findings fundamentally changed how we understand frontal lobe trauma. The new research focused not just on the gray matter, the cortex, but on the white matter, the brain's massive high-speed wiring system.
And the tamping iron intersected only about 4% of the cerebral cortex.
A relatively small amount of the processing tissue itself was lost.
But the true devastation was in the connections.
Exactly. They calculated that more than 10% of Gage's total white matter connections were damaged. The iron's passage just severed the major highway systems.
Connecting what to what?
Linking the left frontal, left temporal, and the right frontal cortices, the areas for executive function, language, and social processing, to the limbic structures, which handle emotion.
So the processor might have survived, but the internet was unplugged.
That is a perfect analogy. The loss of these connections was the major contributor to his dramatic behavioral change. It compromised his emotional regulation and his executive functions far more effectively than the loss of the cortical tissue alone. It shows us that identity is sustained by connectivity, not just localized storage.
The conclusion we draw from P.A. and Gage is that brain injury effects are far from uniform. It's not one single frontal lobe syndrome.
Not at all. Clinically, personality disturbances post-trauma are now highly differentiated. Modern research has systematically subdivided that traditional frontal lobe syndrome concept into 4 highly distinct subtypes.
And this complexity is crucial, right? Because if we want to provide tailored rehabilitation, we have to know which part of the executive system has been damaged.
We have to. You can't treat it all the same.
Can you walk us through those 4 categories?
Certainly. First, you have executive disturbances. This is about the loss of planning, organization, cognitive flexibility, problem solving, the core managerial functions of the brain.
Like a CEO who can't manage their company anymore.
Exactly. It's often associated with just a generalized cognitive slowness or difficulty shifting tasks.
Okay, second.
The second is dysregulation of emotions and behavior. This is where we see the really dramatic shifts in social behavior. It combines what used to be 2 separate categories: emotional dysregulation and disturbed social behavior.
So this is Mr. Thompson.
This is Mr. Thompson. Disinhibition, aggression, impulse control problems, or just a total lack of a filter when communicating. This category is rooted in the ventral and medial frontal regions.
Third is the opposite end of that energy spectrum.
Yes. The third is hypoemotionality and de-energization. And this is characterized predominantly by apathy. It's a profound loss of motivation, of drive, and of concern.
And the fourth?
The fourth category is simply distress anxiety. This can involve heightened worry, irritability, or just a generalized psychological unease following the injury.
That third subtype, apathy, seems especially complex because it's so pervasive after a TBI. And it's not just depression or sadness.
That is the critical distinction. Apathy is widespread. It occurs in the vast majority of TBI patients. And it's a symptom that can manifest across those first 3 subtypes because it can originate from different neural breakdowns.
So if someone is apathetic, how do we know if it's an executive problem or an emotional one?
Well, if the apathy is linked to damage in the ventromedial or orbitofrontal cortex, it often shows up as a disorder of self-initiated behavior. The person may know what they need to do, but they lack the effective emotional input, the want to begin. That's hypoemotionality apathy.
An impaired drive.
Exactly. Now, contrast that with damage to the dorsolateral prefrontal system. This results in what we call executive apathy. The person might have the drive, but they are impaired in their ability to initiate the internal cognitive processes needed for complex behavior. Selection, flexibility, planning.
So they get stuck, not because they don't care, but because they can't manage the steps.
Precisely. And understanding which circuit is broken is the key to choosing whether rehabilitation should target motivation or cognitive flexibility.
To bring this back to PA for a second, his constant confusion, his inability to stick with a task for more than 2 hours.
That would fit squarely under executive disturbances.
But his impulsive, repetitive borrowing of identities.
That strongly points toward dysregulation of emotions and behavior. A profound loss of that core internal structure that governs our appropriate social identity.
And then there's the clinical concept of lack of stamina, central fatigue.
Right. This persistent, profound exhaustion that affects up to 72% of mild stroke patients even a year after the event. It's a massive barrier to reintegration and returning to function. It seems to be a non-specific consequence of generalized damage, suggesting the brain is simply exhausting its resources just trying to maintain basic function.
Let's look at another behavioral curiosity that results from frontal lobe disruption, one that PA sometimes exhibited, Witzelsucht, the compulsive addiction to joking.
This term, from the German for joke, Witz, and addiction, Sucht, describes this excessive, inappropriate facetiousness. It's often paired with moria, which is a kind of childish, silly excitement.
It's a classic indicator of damage, isn't it?
Yeah.
Particularly to the right orbitofrontal region.
It is. And PA was described as a known wit before his accident. He had a sharp intellect with humor. But post-injury, his humor was just socially bizarre. Like proclaiming the clinic was a garage, the finesse was gone.
The clinical examples are often alarming because of how inappropriate the jokes are. One case involved a patient who developed compulsive joking after a stroke. This patient became disinhibited, displaying overly affectionate behavior toward younger female staff, and he compulsively collected pages and pages of silly, often sexual or scatological puns.
And he'd wake his wife up just to tell her a bad joke.
In the middle of the night, bursting with laughter.
I can only imagine the impact on the family. What's the fundamental paradox here? Why are these patients internally driven to joke, but they can't appreciate complex external humor?
The paradox is key. Patients with Witzelsucht are often insensitive to externally generated complex humor. They might intellectually recognize the punchline, but they don't experience the effective response, the mirth, the feeling of funniness.
So their humor is entirely
Internally driven.
So they make jokes, but they can't feel the joy of a joke told by someone else. What is the anatomy of that distinction?
The condition usually requires a specific pattern of damage, often bifrontal dysfunction with a right frontal dominance. The damage to the right dorsolateral and ventrolateral frontal lobes impairs the capacity to process and integrate complex external humor, which relies heavily on context and nuance.
But the joke production continues or even increases.
Yes, because of the second crucial component, concomitant damage to the orbitofrontal cortex, the OFC. The OFC is vital for social appropriateness and inhibitory control.
It's the brain's brake pedal.
It is, and when it's damaged, the brake is removed. This allows the self-generated, often low-quality compulsive jokes to bypass the damaged external processing system and activate the limbic and subcortical reward circuits directly. They get an immediate reward kick from their own jokes, regardless of quality or social setting. It's a short-circuited compulsion.
This entire deep dive challenges the fundamental notion of self. We've seen that trauma can wipe out identity as easily as it breaks a bone. So philosophically, what is the self that PA lost? Is it an object or is it a process?
The neurological findings really strongly support the philosophical concept that was advanced by thinkers like Hume and William James. They argued the self is not a persistent, concrete thing.
It's not a noun.
It's not a noun, it's a recurrent state, a dynamic process that is constantly being created and recreated in each moment. Identity is a verb.
And the brain achieves this dynamic process by creating two specific components of self. This is where the microgenetic theory of self comes in.
Correct. The first component is the minimal self. This is the irreducible core awareness of being an entity right here, right now. It's the foundational awareness that allows an organism to function as a unified agent.
And PA always retained his minimal self.
Always. He knew he was experiencing fear or he's asking questions.
But the minimal self needs context to become the person we recognize.
And that's the longitudinal self. This is the narrative, the autobiographical self that arises when memory successfully bundles all those discrete moments of the minimal self together.
It allows for mental time travel.
Exactly. The ability to relate the present moment to past history and project it into future goals. It requires coherence and continuity.
And PA's case is a clinical disaster for the longitudinal self.
He demonstrates a minimal self that's just stranded in the moment. He lacks autobiographical memory. He lacks reasoned choice because his values are inaccessible, and he lacks coherence. Without that successful bundling mechanism, the damaged white matter and the compromised right frontal lobe, he cannot create that unified biography that makes us feel continuous over time,
He's forced to live only in the immediate present.
which leads to that rapid loss of personal identity.
It makes the loss of narrative terrifyingly literal. Identity is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. If the emotional weight and significance are removed from those memories, if the facts are there, but the feeling that they belong to me is gone, then the identity problems are, as the source says, hardly surprising.
He retained the objective facts of the world, but he lost the capacity to integrate those facts into his personal biography. The self requires continuity, coherence, and unity. PA lost all three, forcing his brain to constantly grasp for these temporary external narratives to fill that immense internal void.
Moving from the nature of the self to the practical clinical implications. If TBI can cause such subtle and complex neurological fragmentation, it raises an urgent question. How many patients are being misdiagnosed after a severe accident, especially those who can't communicate?
This is the hidden crisis of cognitive motor dissociation, or CMD. It's estimated that up to 25% of patients who are labeled in the ICU as unresponsive or vegetative may actually be conscious.
They're locked in.
They are locked in. They are physically unable to show any sign of their awareness. Traditional bedside exams are simply not sensitive enough to detect subtle, purposeful brain activity.
And the sources introduce an incredibly exciting technological solution designed to detect this covert consciousness, an AI tool called CME.
CME is designed to be non-invasive and inexpensive. It's really addressing an enormous ethical and diagnostic blind spot. It uses high-resolution video and computer vision to analyze involuntary microscopic facial movements in response to verbal commands.
So even if the patient can't open their eyes, the computer vision can pick up microexpressions.
Exactly. The human eye cannot detect them, but the computer vision algorithm can. It detects and statistically measures these movements in response to clear commands like open your eyes or show us a smile.
It's looking for purposeful movement, however small.
Purposeful, coordinated movement. Machine learning analyzes these movements against the probability of it just being chance.
And the clinical impact, particularly for prognosis, has been remarkable.
It has. In clinical trials, CME successfully detected purposeful movement up to 4 days earlier than traditional physical exams.
4 days earlier, why is that so important?
Because patients who showed those early responses on the CME test were significantly more likely to regain consciousness, and they demonstrated better functional outcomes at discharge. It serves as a powerful, objective prognostic marker.
The ethical weight of this just cannot be overstated. Knowing that up to a quarter of seemingly unresponsive patients may be conscious is chilling.
It is. And a tool like CME is critical for preventing the inappropriate withdrawal of life support and ensuring that conscious patients, like those with CMD, get the essential neurorehabilitation that they desperately need.
We have to revisit the ethical complexity that was introduced by Mr. Thompson, the construction worker with the nail in his frontal lobe. His case speaks directly to the profound impairment of rational decision-making capacity, or DMC, after TBI.
It does.
Thompson was clearly oriented. He was intelligent enough to understand the risks and benefits of his surgery, yet his behavior was just grossly inappropriate. What does that tell us about the criteria for DMC?
DMC requires 4 distinct criteria. The patient must be able to communicate a choice. They have to understand the relevant information. They have to appreciate the situation and its consequences. And, most crucially, they have to be able to rationally manipulate information to arrive at a choice.
And Thompson failed that last criterion, despite his apparent awareness.
He did. While he understood the facts of the surgery, his frontal lobe damage caused him to make choices that were grossly irrational and utterly incongruent with his pre-injury values, disparaging his family, questioning his children. His choices were driven by neurological impulse, not reasoned deliberation tied to his life history.
So the neurosurgeons couldn't trust his consent, even if he verbalized it clearly.
Exactly. They couldn't, because the process of his decision-making was corrupted by the injury.
The expert commentary really emphasizes that identity, at its core, is an autobiography. It's a coherent story of emotionally loaded, significant events.
And when TBI destroys the ability to create and sustain that narrative, it fundamentally compromises the patient's ability to weigh consequential decisions in a way that respects their past life and their future well-being.
This leads us to the final and most hopeful step. If identity change is a normal, though highly traumatic, consequence of severe TBI, how do survivors and their families navigate this forced reinvention?
The emotional fallout is immense. Families grieve the loss of the old me, and survivors feel disconnected. But the sources provide a crucial insight. The change, while born of tragedy, is not the end of the journey. Some survivors, after a significant period of adjustment, actually report preferring their new self.
So the key is accepting that the identity is fundamentally changed and moving into reconstruction.
It is.
If you, the listener, are dealing with this or supporting a TBI survivor, how do you even start rebuilding that shattered narrative?
The sources outline specific, actionable strategies. First and foremost is finding support. This means engaging immediately with professionals who specialize in brain injury, neuropsychologists, physical therapists, and support groups. Connecting with other survivors normalizes the experience and provides a safe space to explore the new self.
The second strategy is more about internal definition.
Yes, redefining the self. Identity change often involves grieving the loss of major functions, like a professional career that's no longer possible, as in PA's case. The critical work is to shift the focus from what's been lost to identifying core values that remain constant. Are you still kind? Are you creative?
Yeah.
Determined? These intrinsic values become the new foundation.
And finally, the advice is to move to action and discovery.
The sources suggest that many survivors find themselves again by engaging in new activities, hobbies, or volunteering, often without a predefined plan or goal.
You just have to start doing things.
You do. The self is dynamic. And by actively exploring the world and engaging in new behaviors, the brain is forced to establish new narratives and new connections. It's building the longitudinal self one moment at a time. The ultimate reminder is to reject comparison. Being a brain injury survivor is only one facet of who you are. Your journey is unique, and comparing your experience to others only hinders the unique work of your own reconstruction.
This deep dive into Patient P.A., Phineas Gage, and Mr. Thompson has really forced us to confront the fact that identity isn't some soul or abstract concept. It is a fragile, dynamic construction, maintained by the continuous integrity of our neural pathways and our white matter connectivity.
We've seen how physical trauma can shatter that process, resulting in this terrifying fragmentation of identity, a desperate search for coherence, and the progressive nature of the injury that can lead to dementia-like symptoms years later.
The complexity just underscores the absolute necessity of rigorous diagnosis, like the AI tool Seaman and long-term multidisciplinary care.
It really does.
It's the ultimate tragedy, losing the internal story that makes you you.
And this leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to consider about the nature of consciousness. Patient P.A., the physician who forgot his family but retained his textbook knowledge, showed us that memory is highly compartmentalized. The emotional, personal history was vaporized, yet the objective, functional knowledge remained trapped.
So if the facts of the old PA, his skills, his intellect, his semantic memory, were never truly destroyed but merely severed from the mechanism that integrated them into his personal narrative.
Was the old PA actually lost? Or was he merely inaccessible, trapped behind a cognitive black hole of severed emotional connections, just waiting for a key to reconnect his functional brain to his forgotten self? It is a terrifying implication that we might be whole, yet irretrievably locked away inside ourselves.
A difficult but necessary thought to carry forward. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.